Hello and welcome back. Nick here, and we are deep into His Majesty's Dragon, Book 1 of the Temeraire series by the great Naomi Novik, and we are just about to embark on Chapter 12, where clearly we're on the doorstep of the epic climax here. By the next morning, Precursorus had already gone, sent away to a dragon transport launching from Portsmouth for the small covert in Nova Scotia, where he would be led to Newfoundland and at last immured in the breeding grounds which had lately been started there. Lawrence had avoided any further sight of the stricken dragon, and deliberately had kept Temeraire awake late the night before, so that he would sleep past the moment of departure. Lenton had chosen his time as wisely as he could. The general rejoicing over the victory at Trafalgar continued, and served to counter the private unhappiness to some extent. That very day, a display of fireworks was announced by pamphlets to be held over the mouth of the Thames, and Lily, Temeraire, and Maximus, being the youngest of the dragons of the covert and the worst affected, were sent to observe by Lenton's orders. Lawrence was deeply grateful for the word, as the brilliant displays lit the sky and the music from the barges drifted to them across the water. Temeraire's eyes were wide with excitement, the bright bursts of color reflecting in his pupils and his scales, and he cocked his head first one way, then another, in an effort to hear more clearly. He talked of nothing but the music and the explosions and the lights, all the way back to the covert. "Is that a concert, then, the sort they have in Dover?" he asked. "Lawrence, cannot we go again? Perhaps a little closer next time. I could sit very quietly, and I would not disturb anyone." "I'm afraid fireworks such as those are a special occasion, my dear. Concerts are only music," Lawrence said, avoiding an answer. He could well imagine the reaction of the city's inhabitants to a dragon's coming to take in a concert. "Oh," Temeraire said, but he was not greatly dampened. "I would still like that extremely. I could not hear very well tonight." "I do not know that there is any suitable accommodation which could be made in the city," Lawrence said, slowly and reluctantly. But happily, a sudden inspiration came to him, and he added, "But perhaps I can hire some musicians to come to the covert and play for you instead. That would be a great deal more comfortable in any case." "Yes, indeed, that would be splendid," Temeraire said eagerly. He communicated this idea to Maximus and Lily as soon as they had all once again landed, and the two of them professed quite equal interest. "Damn you, Lawrence, you had better learn to say no. You will forever be getting us into these absurd starts," Berkeley said. "Just see if any musicians will come here, for love or money." "For love, perhaps not, but for a week's wages and a hearty meal, I'm quite certain most musicians could be persuaded to play in the heart of Bedlam," Lawrence said. "It sounds a fine idea to me," Harcourt said. "I would quite like it myself. I've not been to a concert except once, when I was 16. I had to put on skirts for it, and after only half an hour a dreadful fellow sat next to me and whispered impolite remarks until I poured a pot of coffee into his lap. It quite spoiled my pleasure, even though he went away straight after." "Christ above, Harcourt! If I ever have reason to offend you, I will make damn sure you have nothing hot at hand," Berkeley said, while Lawrence struggled between nearly equal portions of dismay at her having been subjected to such an insult and at her means of repulsion. "Well, I would have struck him, but I would have had to get up. There's no notion how difficult it is to arrange skirts when sitting down. It took me 5 minutes together the first time," she said reasonably, "so I did not want to have to do it all over again. Then the waiter came by, and I thought that would be easier, and anyway, more like something a girl ought to do." Still a little pale with the notion, Lawrence bade them good night and took Temeraire off to his rest. He slept once again in the small tent by his side, even though he thought Temeraire was well over his distress, and was rewarded in the morning by being woken early, Temeraire peering into the tent with one great eye, inquiring if perhaps Lawrence would like to go to Dover and arrange for the concert today. "I would like to sleep until a civilized hour, but as that is evidently not to be, Perhaps I will ask leave of Lenton to go, Lawrence said, yawning as he crawled from the tent. May I have my breakfast first? Oh, certainly, Temeraire said with an air of generosity. Muttering a little, Lawrence pulled his coat back and began to walk back to the headquarters. Halfway to the building, he nearly collided with Morgan, running to find him. Sir, Admiral Lenton wants you, the boy... Oh, whoops, it's a boy. Sir, Admiral Lenton wants you, the boy said, panting with excitement. Then Lawrence had steadied him. And he says, Temeraire is to go into combat rig. Very good, Lawrence said, concealing his surprise. Go tell Lieutenant Granby and Mr. Holland at once, and then do as Lieutenant Granby tells you. Mind you, speak of this to no one else. Yes, sir, the boy said, and dashed off again to the barracks. Lawrence quickened his pace. Come in, Lawrence, Lenton said in reply to his knock. It seemed that every other captain in the covert was already crowded into the office as well. To Lawrence's surprise, Rankin was at the front of the room, sitting by Lenton's desk. By wordless agreement, they had managed to avoid speaking to one another since Rankin's transfer from Loch-Lagan, and Lawrence had known nothing of his and Levitas's activities. These had evidently been more dangerous than Lawrence might have imagined. A bandage around Rankin's thigh was very visibly stained with blood, and his clothes also. His thin face was pale and set with pain. Lenton waited only until the door was closed behind the last few stragglers to begin. He said grimly, I dare say you already realize, gentlemen, we have been celebrating too soon. Captain Rankin has just returned from a flight over the coast. He was able to slip past their borders and caught a look at what that damned Corsican has been working on. You may see for yourselves. He pushed across his desk a sheet of paper, smudged with dirt and bloodstains that did not obscure an elegantly drafted diagram in Rankin's precise hand. Lawrence frowned, trying to puzzle the thing out. It looked rather like a ship of the line, but with no railings at all around her upper deck, and no masts shipped, with strange thick beams protruding from both sides, fore and aft, and no gun ports. What is it for? Chenery said, turning it around. I thought he already had boats. Perhaps it will become clearer if I explain that he had dragons carrying them out over the ground, Rankin said. Lawrence understood at once. The beams were intended to give the dragons a place to hold. Napoleon meant to fly his troops over the Navy's guns entirely, while so many of Britain's aerial forces were occupied at the Mediterranean. What a stroke, right? Lenton said, We are not certain how many men he will have in each. Sir, I beg your pardon. May I ask, how long are these vessels? Lawrence asked, interrupting. And is this to scale? To my eye, yes, Rankin said. The one which I saw in mid-air had 2 reapers to a side, and room to spare, perhaps 200 feet from front to back. They will be 3-deckers inside, then, Lawrence said grimly. If they sling hammocks, he can fit as many as 2,000 men apiece, for a short journey, if he means to carry no provisions. A murmur of alarm went around the room. Lenton said, Less than 2 hours to cross each way, even if they launch from Cherbourg, and he has 60 dragons or more. He could land 50,000 men by mid-morning, good God, said one of the captains Lawrence did not know, a man who had arrived only recently. The same calculation was running in all their heads. It was impossible not to look about the room and tally their own side. Less than 21 men, a good quarter of whom were the scout and courier captains whose beasts could do very little in combat. But surely the things must be hopeless to manage in the air. And can the dragons carry such a weight? Sutton asked, studying the design further. Likely he has built them with light wood. He only needs them to last a day, after all. And they need not be watertight, Lawrence said. He needs only an easterly wind to carry them over, and with that narrow framing they'll offer very little resistance. But they will be vulnerable in the air, and surely Excidium and Mortiferous are already on their way back. 4 days away, at best, and Bonaparte must know that as well as we do, Lenton said. He's spent nearly his entire fleet, and the Spanish as well, to buy himself freedom from their presence. He's not going to waste the chance. The obvious truth of this was felt at once. A grim and expectant silence fell upon the room. Lenton looked down at his desk, and then stood up, uncharacteristically slow. Lawrence, for the first time, noticed that his hair was gray and thin. "Gentlemen," Lenton said formally, "the wind is in the north today, so we may have a little grace if he chooses to wait for a better wind. All of our scouts will be flying in shifts just off Cherbourg. We'll have an hour's warning, at least. I do not need to tell you that we will be hopelessly outnumbered. We can only do our best, and delay if we cannot prevent." No one spoke, and after a moment he said, "We will need every heavy and middleweight beast on independent duty. Your task will be to destroy these transports. Chenery, Warren, the two of you will take mid-wing positions in Lily's formation, and two of our scouts will take the wingtip positions. Captain Harcourt, undoubtedly Bonaparte will reserve some dragons for defense. Your task is to keep those defenders occupied as best you can." "Yes, sir," she said. The others nodded. Lenton took a deep breath and rubbed his face. "There's nothing else to be said, gentlemen. Go to your preparations." There was no sense in keeping it from the men. The French had nearly caught Rankin on his way back and already knew that their secret at last was out. Lawrence quietly told his lieutenants, then sent them about their work. He could see the passage of the news through the ranks, men leaning in to hear from one another, their faces hardening as they grasped the situation, and the ordinary idle conversation of a morning vanishing quite away. He was proud to see even the youngest officers take it with great courage and go straight back to their work. This was the first time Temeraire would ever use the complete accoutrement of heavy combat outside of practice. For patrol, a much lighter set of gear was used, and their previous engagement had been under traveling harness. Temeraire stood very straight and still, only his head turned about so he could watch with great excitement as the men rigged him out with the heaviest leather harness, triple riveted, and began hooking in the enormous panels of chain mesh that would serve as armor. Lawrence began his own inspection of the equipment and belatedly realized that Holland was nowhere to be seen. He looked 3 times through the whole clearing before he quite believed the man's absence, and then called the armorer Pratt away from his work on the great protective plates which should shield Temeraire's breast and shoulders during the fighting. "Where is Mr. Holland?" he asked. "Why, I don't believe I've seen him this morning, sir," Pratt said, scratching his head. "He was in last night, though." "Very good," Lawrence said, and dismissed him. "Roland, Dyer, Morgan," he called, and then the 3 runners came. He said, "Go and see if you can find Mr. Holland, and tell him I expect him here at once, if you please." "Yes, sir," they said almost in unison, and dashed off in different directions after a hurried consultation. He returned to watching the men work, a deep frown on his face. He was astonished and dismayed to find the man failing in his duty at all, and under these circumstances most particularly. He wondered if Holland could have fallen ill or gone to the surgeons. It seemed the only excuse, but the man would surely have told one of his crewmates. More than an hour went by, and Temeraire was in full rig with the crew practicing boarding maneuvers under Lieutenant Granby's severe eye, before young Roland came hurrying back to the clearing. "Sir," she said, panting and unhappy. "Sir, Mr. Holland is with Levitas. Please do not be angry," she said, all in one rushing breath. "Ah," Lawrence said, a little embarrassed. He could hardly admit to Roland that he had been turning a blind eye to Holland's visits, so she naturally was reluctant to be a tale-bearer on a fellow aviator. "He will have to answer for it, but that can wait. Go and tell him he's needed, at once." "Sir, I told him so, but he said he cannot leave Levitas, and he told me to go away at once, and to tell you that he begs you to come, if only you can," she said very quickly, and eyeing him nervously to see how he would take this insubordination. Lawrence stared. He could not account for the extraordinary response. But, after a moment, his estimate of Holland's character decided him. "Mr. Granby," he called, "I must go for a moment. I leave things in your hands. Roland, stay here and fetch me at once if anything occurs," he told her. He walked quickly, torn between temper and concern, and reluctance to once again expose himself to a complaint from Rankin, particularly under the circumstances. No one could deny the man had done his duty bravely just now, and to offer him insult directly after would be an extraordinary piece of rudeness. And at the same time, Lawrence could not help but grow angry at the man as he followed Roland's directions. Levitas's clearing was one of the small ones nearest the headquarters, undoubtedly chosen for Rankin's convenience rather than his dragons. The grounds were poorly tended, and when Levitas came into view, Lawrence saw he was lying in a circle of bare, sandy dirt, with his head in Holland's lap. "Well, Mr. Holland, what's all this?" Lawrence said, irritation making his tone sharp. Then he came around and saw the great expanse of bandages that covered Levitas's flank and belly, hidden from the other side, and already soaked through with the near black blood. "My God," he said involuntarily. Levitas's eyes opened a little at the sound and turned up to look at him hopefully. They were glazed and bright with pain, and after a moment recognition came into them, and the little dragon sighed and closed them again without a word. "Sir," Holland said, "I'm sorry. I know I've my duty, but I couldn't leave him. The surgeon's gone. Says there's nothing more to be done for him, and it won't be long. There's no one here at all, not even to send for some water." He stopped and said again, "I couldn't leave him." Lawrence knelt beside him and put his hand on Levitas's head, very lightly for fear of causing him more pain. "No," he said, "of course not." He was glad to find himself so close to the headquarters. There were some crewmen idling by the door, talking of the news, so he could send them to Holland's assistance, and Rankin was in the officers' club, easily found. He was drinking wine, his color already greatly improved, and having shifted his blood-stained clothing for fresh. Lenton and a couple of the scout captains were sitting with him, discussing positions to hold along the coastline. Coming up to him, Lawrence told him very quietly, "If you can walk, get on your feet. Otherwise, I will carry you." Rankin put down his glass and stared at him coldly. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I gather this is some more of your officious—" And then Lawrence paid no attention, but seized the back of his chair and heaved. Rankin fell forward, scrabbling to catch himself on the floor. Lawrence took him by the scruff of his coat and dragged him up to his feet, ignoring his gasp of pain. "Lawrence, what in God's name?" Lenton said in astonishment, rising to his feet. "Levitas is dying. Captain Rankin wishes to make his farewells," Lawrence said, looking Lenton squarely in the eye and holding Rankin up by the collar and the arm. "He begs to be excused." The other captains stared, half out of their chairs. Lenton looked at Rankin, then very deliberately sat back down again. "Very good," he said, and reached for the bottle. The other captains slowly sank back down as well. Rankin stumbled along in his grip, not even trying to free himself, shrinking a little from Lawrence as they went. Outside the clearing, Lawrence stopped and faced him. "You will be generous to him. Do you understand me?" he said. "You will give him every word of praise he has earned from you and never received. You will tell him he has been brave and loyal and a better partner than you have deserved." Rankin said nothing, only stared as if Lawrence were a dangerous lunatic. Lawrence shook him again. "By God, you will do all this and more, and hope that it is enough to satisfy me," he said savagely, and dragged him on. Holland was still sitting with Levitas's head in his lap, a bucket now beside him. He was squeezing water from a clean cloth into the dragon's open mouth. He looked at Rankin without bothering to hide his contempt. But then he bent over and he said, "Levitas, come along now. Look who's come." Levitas's eyes opened, but they were milky and blind. "My captain?" he said uncertainly. Lawrence thrust Rankin forward and down onto his knees, none too gently. Rankin gasped and clutched at his thigh, but he said, "Yes, I am here." He looked up at Lawrence and swallowed, and then added awkwardly, "You have been very brave." There was nothing natural or sincere in the tone. It was as ungraceful as could be imagined. But Levitas only said very softly, "You came." He licked at a few drops of water at the corner of his mouth, The blood was still welling sluggishly from behind the dressing, thick enough to slightly part the bandages, one from the other, glistening and black. Rankin shifted uneasily. His breeches and stockings were being soaked through. But he looked up at Lawrence and did not try to move away. Levitas gave a low sigh, and then the shallow movement of his sides ceased. Holland closed his eyes with one rough hand. It's pretty sad. Obviously, dragons are not real, but you hear the story, you know the background of how Levitas was so abused by his owner. And, humans who are lovers of beasts, your heart goes out even to the dragon, Lawrence's hand was still heavy on the back of Rankin's neck. Now he lifted it away, rage gone, and only tight-lipped disgust left. "Go," he said. "We, who valued him, will make the arrangements, not you." He did not even look at the man as Rankin left the clearing. "I cannot stay," he said quietly to Holland. "Can you manage?" "Yes," Holland said, stroking the little head. "There can't be anything with the battle coming and all. But I'll see he's taken and buried proper. Thank you, sir. It meant a great deal to him." "More than it ought," Lawrence said. He stood looking down at Levitas a short while longer. Then he went back to the headquarters and found Admiral Lenton. "Well?" Lenton asked, scowling as Lawrence was shown into his office. "Sir, I apologize for my behavior," Lawrence said. "I'm happy to bear any consequences you should think appropriate." No, what are you talking about? I mean Levitas," Lenton said impatiently. Lawrence paused and then said, "Dead, with a great deal of pain, but he went easily at the end." Lenton shook his head. "Damned pity," he said, pouring a glass of brandy for Lawrence and himself. He finished his own glass in 2 great swallows and sighed heavily. "And a wretched time for Rankin to become unharnessed," he said. "We have a Winchester hatching unexpectedly at Chatham, any day now, by the hardening of the shell. I've been scrambling to find a fellow in range worthy of the position and willing to be put on a Winchester. Now here he is, on the loose, and having made himself a hero, bringing us this news. If I don't send him, and the beast ends up unharnessed, we will have a yowl from his entire damned family, and a question taken up in Parliament, like as not." "I would rather see a dragon dead than in his hands," Lawrence said, setting down his glass hard. "Sir, if you want a man who will be a credit to the service, send Mr. Holland. I can vouch with my life for him." "What? Your ground crew, master?" Lenton frowned at him, but thoughtfully. "That is a thought. If you think him suited to the task, he could not feel he was hurting his career by such a step. Not a gentleman, I suppose?" "No, sir, unless by gentleman you mean a man of honor rather than of breeding," Lawrence said. Lenton snorted at this. "Well, we're not so stiff-necked a lot, we must pay that a great deal of mind," he said. "And I dare say it will answer nicely. If we are not all dead or captured by the time the egg cracks, at any rate." And I'm going to pause there. I wanted to get a session in for you folks. Again, thanks for the patience and the support. Really cool story. We're on the eve of battle here. Stick with us, and we will see you on the next one.